Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start this time with Ukraine. Not any real news because you really can't do that in a 2-week time frame, but rather just some observations and a few comments. We start with the fact that there are indications that at least an outline of a possible peace settlement may be coming together. And how's that for a string of weasel words? Indications, at least, outline, possible, and maybe, all in one sentence. But that is the hope that we have right now. Ukraine has declared that it's prepared to agree to be neutral, to not join NATO, and to be nuclear weapons free in exchange for binding security guarantees from several third-party countries, and to hold talks over a 15-year period on the future of Crimea. Over the weekend, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky said that while, quoting, Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are beyond doubt, he also suggested that compromise might be possible over the complex issue of Donbass. Now, it's hard to see now how those two goals can be met simultaneously, but you know, that's why you have negotiations. On the Russian side, Vladimir Budinsky, the head of the Russian delegation, called the Ukrainian proposals a step to meet us halfway and clearly positive, which is encouraging in the sense that it hints at the existence of actual negotiations. That is, both sides going beyond, posturing and demands to considering where they can compromise, where they can go, yeah, all right, I can live with that. Meanwhile, Russia has claimed that it is significantly scaling back its military operations in the north, although as I do this, there's yet to be any real signs of any significant change, with only 20% of forces removed and the shelling continuing. But what Russia said is that it's now going to concentrate on what it now claims was actually the goal all along, the liberation of the Donbass region. Now, that's a major stand down from prior goals, and frankly, it reeks of looking for the door, or as I put it some weeks ago now in a slightly different context, a way to back down, or back out rather, without appearing to back down. A question now is if Zelensky is prepared to be realistic about Crimea and the portions of Donbass under control of the separatists. Now that the Russians have been stalled and the Ukrainians have even regained some towns that have been lost, the temptation can be to push on, to cross the line from defense and survival to offense and victory. But Crimea and rebel-held Donbass were not lost to Ukraine in 2022, but in 2014. And there's no reasonable prospect of getting either one back, either by war or settlement. Happily, it appears that Zelensky is being realistic about this, and personally, I believe that he's steeling himself to the loss of some territory and is now focused on trying to make that loss as small as possible. The U.S., for its part, did not offer the best response to the Russian statements about its plans and intentions, suggesting they could be a ruse, and pretty much dismissing them, in the words of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, as a possible attempt by Moscow to deceive people and deflect attention. Better, frankly, would have been to say something like, we welcome the statement from Russian officials promising relief from the suffering inflicted on the people of Kyiv and other cities, and look forward to seeing concrete steps toward that end. We sincerely hope that this will be followed by similar actions elsewhere in Ukraine and an opening to intensive negotiations to end this war. In other words, play the diplomatic BS game. I mean, how do you politically justify a settlement? How do you justify negotiations if you start by saying that you simply cannot believe a single thing your enemy says? Moving from there to another point. We might consider this an example of what I call the little thing, something that got passed over largely without comment, but which may actually be significant or revealing. Sam Cherub, a Russia expert with the RAND Corporation, said recently that Russia's attack on Ukraine had brought its forces closer to NATO's borders, with some being stationed in Belarus. Should those troops remain there, he said, the contact line, that is the meeting point between Russian and NATO forces, would shift significantly west. And that changes the strategic landscape. Poland has relied on Belarus to provide a sort of buffer, he said. That's no longer there. That's just a totally different ballgame. Okay, so the presence of Russian forces in Belarus moves that contact line significantly west, and that's supposed to be of serious concern to NATO. But wouldn't the addition of Ukraine to NATO, as was the original idea, move that same contact line even further to the east? So why was that going to be supposedly of no security concern whatsoever to Russia? Why wouldn't that be a totally different ballgame? The age-old practice, frankly, of seeing every conflict through a lens of good us versus evil them is alive and well. A final note on this is how war-inspired nationalism can drive people nuts. The Space Foundation, an educational nonprofit headquartered in Colorado Springs, has changed the name of a yearly forum it sponsors from Yuri's Night to a celebration of space, discover what's next. Because Yuri, that is Yuri Gagarin, the first person in space, was Russian. This group said this was done in light of world events, a statement which was later scrubbed from its website. The Montreal Symphony has dropped a Russian piano prodigy from its concerts. Remember, this is a kid, remember, it's a prodigy. The Cardiff Philharmonic canceled a planned concert of the music of Tchaikovsky. The Glasgow Film Festival dropped a movie by a Russian filmmaker, even though he has Ukrainian roots, has family in Kyiv, and has condemned the war. But, you know, Russia, so... Businesses in the U.S. owned by Russian immigrants have been threatened with bombings. Bars are dumping out vodka, even if it wasn't made in Russia. A classic Quebec snack is off the menu in some places in France and Canada because it's called Putin. And some people think it has something to do with Vladimir Putin. This, folks, this is real cancel culture. People are being dropped, dissed and dismissed, removed, not because of anything stupid or bigoted they said or did, but because of who they are, or in some cases were, where they are from, what native language they speak. You know, the truth is, I'm not actually a big fan of Tchaikovsky, but I think later I'm just going to go listen to some. By the way, Putin, described as the ultimate French-Canadian fast food, is French fries, cheese curds, and gravy, which actually sounds pretty good. All right, next up, our frequent feature, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages, starting as we usually do with the clowns. And we have 3 this time. And the first 2 are special clown awards for political cowardice. And they both go to senators who are gobbers. The first is Senator Rick Scott of Florida, or as we know him around here, Voldemort, who recently proposed his 11-point plan to rescue America that would, among other brilliancies, have all Americans have skin in the game with regard to federal income taxes, which means a tax increase on the poorest 40% of Americans because they're now too poor to owe any. Also, the program has a potentially sunsetting of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. When faced with some pushback by John Roberts of Faux News on this, who pointed out those points, Voldemort dismissed Roberts' comments as Democrat talking points, not only failing to defend his plan, but actually refusing to acknowledge that these were literally his own words. And that is some champion-level political cowardice. Next, there's Indiana Gopper Senator Mike Braun, who said in an interview that Roe v. Wade should be overturned because matters like abortion should be left to the states, with no limits on how restrictive their laws could be. Asked if that would apply to a case like Loving v. Virginia, which was the Supreme Court decision that struck down bans on interracial marriage, Braun said yes. When asked again if that is what he meant, he said yes again. Now, you could give him credit for consistency. It's a stupid consistency, but at least it is. Because he said, if you want to leave that sort of thing to the states, you can't pick and choose. Well, he got some pushback on this, and just 5 hours later, he was claiming he misunderstood the line of questioning, even though he was asked the question 2 different ways. When Business Insider magazine later asked what he thought the question was, he said that, well, actually, he just hadn't been paying attention. That's not only cowardly, that's pathetic. A pathetic clown. Our third and final clown here is Irvington Township, New Jersey, which is suing a resident named Eloise McDaniel for, among other reasons, filing over 75 requests for township information within a 3-year span using New Jersey's Open Public Records Act. Now, note that those requests, that averages about to 1 every 2 weeks. But that was still a rate that the town called voluminous, unduly burdensome, time-consuming, and expensive. Note also that the regular requests stopped in the COVID spring of 2020 when Ms. McDaniel, who was 82, decided to focus on her health. So not only is the town complaining about a request every 2 weeks, it's complaining about requests that stopped coming 2 years ago. Both the mayor and the town clerk deny having requested the suit be filed, with the latter, the town clerk, responding to a press inquiry with, "The township does not comment on or discuss pending litigation," even though it's the town's own suit and he himself is listed as a plaintiff. Yeah, that sounds all legit and clownish. Okay, moving on to the outrages, we have one for you. The source of this time is an all too common source, the Supreme Court. On March 23rd, in a move that provoked reactions like shocking, stunning, and lawless from progressives and legal observers, the Supreme Court threw out an election map for Wisconsin legislative districts approved by the state Supreme Court, which not only, in a way that not only made it tougher to justify creating black majority districts, but ignoring a precedent the Supreme Court itself invoked just a few months before. In the wake of the 2020 census, the Gopper-dominated Wisconsin legislature and Governor Tony Evers have been unable to agree on new legislative maps. Ultimately, the case went to the state Supreme Court, which took the unusual but legitimate step of declining to create its own map, instead inviting stakeholders to submit their own proposals, saying it would choose the one that met a standard of the least change from the one adopted in 2011, that is, after the last census. That one proved to be the governor's map, which also created an additional black majority district going from 6 to 7 around Milwaukee. And that was the problem, or more exactly the handle that the Goppers in the legislature lacked onto. The governor, but not the court, the governor had said that creation of additional majority black district was required under the Voting Rights Act because of the changing demographics of the area. And Goppers claimed that such a, quote, maximization, unquote, of majority and minority districts is unconstitutional. Using a shadow docket, that is, an expedited, unsigned decision issued without oral argument or a full briefing, the Supreme Court sent the case back to the Wisconsin Supreme Court on the grounds that that state court had committed legal error in its application of previous decisions regarding the relationship between the constitutional guarantee of equal protection and the Voting Rights Act. I'm going to call them the Soups, okay? The Soups argued that the state court didn't satisfy a requirement for a certain type of strict scrutiny to justify a new majority black district. Doing so despite the fact that there was no Voting Rights Act issue before that court. Now, the state court did in fact address the strict scrutiny standards, but the Soups held that the state Supreme Court had not been strict enough. In a decision, Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan in a dissent called unprecedented, extraordinary, and unnecessary. Now, without getting further into the legal weeds here, what this means is that, as Mark Joseph Stern, who covers U.S. courts for Slate magazine, said, it appears to dramatically alter the law of redistricting to make it much harder for states to draw majority black districts. Or, bluntly, it is another case of a reactionary Supreme Court taking another bite out of what remains of the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And if that wasn't outrage enough, the court not only resorted to a shadow docket, but ignored its own precedent. The 2006 case, Purcell v. Gonzalez, established the principle that courts should not change election rules shortly before an election because doing so could confuse voters and create difficulties for the administrators, taking care of it. Just a few months ago, the Supreme Court refused to hear a case because it was 4 months before that related election, and that they said was just too close. Now, 5 months before the Wisconsin elections, it's apparently supposed to be enough time for the Wisconsin Supreme Court to undertake a complete re-examination of the practical and legal issues and undertake the kind of, quote, intensely local, unquote, consideration of the Milwaukee district the soups are requiring, and still leave election officials enough time to deal with any changes. Or it could, I suppose, just adopt the map from the Gopper-dominated legislature, which somehow I don't think the majority of the soups would have any problem with that. They are beyond outrageous. They are disgusting. And in their drive to turn back the clock to the days of Jim Crow, they are un-American. And they wonder why the public doesn't trust the court, or maybe they just don't care. Let's take a break. And we are back. And we are back here with an occasional feature we have around here. It's called the Hero Award. And it's something given in recognition to someone who just on some matter, big or small, they just did the right thing. This time the recipient is Utah Governor Spencer Cox, a mainstream conservative Republican. On March 22nd, he vetoed a bill meant to stop transgender kids from participating in school sports. Now, that was unusual enough for goppers these days, but it's not unprecedented. In fact, just the day before, Indiana Governor Eric Holcomb, also a gopper, vetoed a similar bill. What's truly noteworthy here is the letter Cox released explaining his veto, one in which, get this now, he showed consideration for transgender kids. He pointed out that Utah has rules similar to those in the NCAA, which requires that in order to compete in women's intercollegiate sports, a trans woman must have completed 1 year of testosterone suppression treatment and show a testosterone level below a defined standard, which certainly seems to be more than sufficient to say that, yeah, this is a real thing for them. It's not some trick they're doing just to, have weaker, they think weaker competition? I don't understand. But Cox goes beyond that to note that there are just 4 trans kids playing school sports in the entire state of Utah, and only one of those is a trans girl. He then compares that to the 86% of trans youths who say they have considered suicide and the 56% who've actually attempted suicide. That's according to one study. Other studies show very similar results. Cox writes, and I'm quoting the letter here, 4 kids and only one of them is playing girls' sports. That's what all of this is about. 4 kids. 4 kids who aren't dominating or winning trophies or taking scholarships. 4 kids who are just trying to find some friends and feel like they're a part of something. 4 kids trying to get through each day. Rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. I don't understand what they're going through or why they feel the way they do, but I want them to live. It seems something like that should be so simple, so natural to say, to feel. And yet among the reactionaries that power the goppers, it's rare. And standing against that power is even rarer, which is why Utah Governor Spencer Cox is a hero. But I have to add a footnote. 3 days later, the Utah legislature had a special meeting just so they could rush through an override of the veto. The bill takes effect with the start of the school year in the fall. As of March 30th, there were 14 states with bans targeting transgender athletes. Now that trend, though, I have to say, takes nothing away from Cox's words. In fact, it puts them in sharper relief. But I want you to bear something in mind. Bear something in mind. Why are these bills being pushed? Why all the attacks on transgender folks, especially children? Well, I mean, of course, it keeps the base riled up, and it's good for these people's, selfish political desires, but there's more to it. Think back a few decades ago to the surge of state constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage. Just in the years 2004 to 2006, 21 states adopted such amendments. Why the push? Again, it was good for riling the base, but why do it? Why would that rile the base? Because it was becoming an issue. Because it was starting to happen. Several European countries had already legalized same-sex civil unions. In 2003, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts legalized same-sex marriage for that state. The point here is that the forces of reaction could sense this. They could see what was coming. They could see what was happening. They were losing, and they knew it. They knew changes were coming. They knew the time was against them, that history was against them, that social progress was against them. And they tried to hold off that day as long as they could, stamping their feet like 6-year-olds who were in a bad mood by throwing up legal roadblocks. It's the same thing now. All the vituperation, all the sneering and sleazy fantasies, all the laws, all the how do you define a woman questions, they're all because they are losing, and they know they're losing. They know that time, that social progress, that the entire tide of history is against them. And in the long run, they can no more hold back that tide than in the cliche version of the story, King Canute could hold back the ocean tide. They'll even admit it, even if only in privately to each other, they would admit that they are the minority. But consider that every time someone goes on about taking back our country, they are essentially admitting that they are not the majority, and they know it, because if they were the majority, they wouldn't have to take it back. They'd already have it. They are losing. And even if they don't think it that directly, they can feel it. That's why the anger. That's why the laws try to hold back the tide. We may be in for some hard times. In fact, I fear that we are, but have faith, because it remains true, as the saying goes. The moral arc of the universe may be long, but it does bend toward justice. All right, we're going to finish up here with a couple of things that are just noted in passing. First up, the Departments of Health of 8 states, plus the District of Columbia, have written to the Food and Drug Administration urging it to drop a policy that says that gay or bisexual men cannot donate blood if they've had sex within the previous 90 days. So, wait, what? Did you know about this? I didn't until I came across this letter. Yes, the FDA has a policy. If you're gay or bi and you've had sex in the last 90 days, you can't give blood. And this is apparently the improved version of it. Until the spring of 2020, it was a year, not 90 days. The policy was put in place in 1983 during the HIV/AIDS panic. And despite all the gains in dealing with HIV, reducing it from a death sentence to a manageable condition, that policy remained. It was only changed because of the sharpened need for blood supply due to COVID. Now, with the Red Cross declaring its worst blood shortage in more than a decade, calls to drop the policy entirely are intensifying. The Minnesota Department of Health, for example, one of the signers of the letter, said in a social media post, the policy, quote, lacks credible evidence, discriminates against gay and bisexual men, and restricts blood donation during a time of extraordinary need. We urge the FDA to drop this ineffective, unnecessary, and discriminatory policy. Spain, Italy, England, Israel, and France have all updated their blood donation processes to include gay and bi people, but the U.S. lags behind, sticking to a policy from 40 years ago. Maybe this should have actually been an outrage, because it certainly is. And this one, I probably should have started with this under good news, but I didn't, so it's here. A new town department in Amherst, Massachusetts, joined several other initiatives, also in western Massachusetts, that offer alternatives to sending police when a call involves a mental health crisis. At least 9 towns in the area are using various alternatives. The Amherst department, for example, will work directly with emergency dispatchers, not under the police. Northampton is creating a similar department with a similar focus on hiring people with lived experience of mental illness. Another model is called co-response, where a mental health clinician goes out on crisis calls with a police officer. That's being done in Springfield, Chicopee, and Holyoke. The nonprofit Clinical and Support Options, that group has state-funded contracts to provide clinical support with police in places like Greenfield, Montague, Hadley, and East Hampton. Now, personally, I still maintain that to fund the police is a hideously bad slogan. But these sorts of examples of what that could mean, of, if you will, putting flesh on the bones of the idea, can certainly help advance the cause. All right, here's an area where I think a lot of the left actually gets it wrong. A number of folks on the left have written or spoken about what I can't even call offensive or disgraceful, because it doesn't rise to that level of coherence, but the insanely nonsensical treatment of Ketanji Jackson Brown at her confirmation hearings before the Judiciary Committee. A lot of those lefties who commented said the reason she got such brain damage treatment is that the goppers on the committee couldn't stand the idea of a black woman on the Supreme Court. But truth is, I think they're wrong. The root of the opposition is not that she's black or a woman or a black woman. Because, I mean, if Candace Owens had been the nominee, I'm sure they would have had no problem with her. No, the reason is she was nominated by a Democrat. That's all it took. All the rest was performance art for the retweets and the likes and the hopes of being in a clip on faux news. Think back to 2016. Think back to the treatment of Merrick Garland, definitely a white guy. With the goppers controlling the Senate, he couldn't even get the common courtesy of informal meetings with goppers on the Judiciary Committee, much less a hearing. Remember how, too, in the fall of 2016, in the face of a potential Hillary Clinton presidency, Fish-Face McConnell and John McCain both said publicly that they would not vote for any Supreme Court nominee put forth by a Clinton White House. So one thing the goppers said is true. This opposition, it's not about race. It's about power. And don't you ever forget it. All right, that's it. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. We will look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, you, as always, have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. As always, peace.